The Hudson Sapphire, that's what the tabloids called it. A stone the size of a walnut and the color of midnight underwater. For 1 week, in late October, it sat behind glass in the Morgan Gallery on West 57th Street, lit like an altar. The gallery called it a showpiece, the collectors called it a trophy, and the city called it an event. Underneath the glamour, though, the sapphire carried a different kind of weight. Whispers of how it was acquired, of families and nations that wanted it back. That's the story that mattered to Elena Ortiz. Elena had been raised on stories of theft and loss. Her abuela in Puerto Rico used to say the world kept two ledgers, one for what you owned and one for what you owed. Elena knew both ledgers intimately. She'd worked 10 years as a consultant for high-end security firms, advising museums and banks on how to keep treasures safe. She knew how people framed value, how institutions wrapped shame and money together, and she'd learned how horribly imperfect the valuations could be. She also knew where the seams in their certainties ran. When the Morgan Gallery announced the Sapphire's exhibition, Elena didn't see a glittering prize. She saw a line stretching back to a coastal village in Kerala, where a diver's family swore the gem had been taken from their temple centuries before. The gallery had bought the gem through an anonymous intermediary. Provenance papers were tidy but not convincing. The owner was a shadow that wore Armani. Elena's ledger tugged at her. She could ignore it, or she could fix it. She didn't plan to take the sapphire for herself. She planned to take it for the ledger, to return it to a place that could never buy its way out of its past. That moral framing, she told herself, justified everything else. Elena's crew was a ragtag collection of specialists and sinners, stitched together by necessity and old favors. Marcus Bell was 42, large-shouldered, with the slow, careful speech of someone who had survived too many meetings. He'd been Elena's first hire years ago when she'd left corporate security. He specialized in reading people. He could stand at a reception desk and tell you, in one slow breath, who in the room had lied 3 times that morning. Jules Park, 29, small and fierce, with a tattoo of waves whipping up their forearm, had grown up on Code and Wildfire. They could make a locked screen sing, and they swore by poetry they stored in encrypted files. Jules was the crew's creative hacker, brilliant and brittle. Darius King was all horsepower and soft hands, a delivery driver who could vanish in a diesel cloud and reappear across the bridge with a crate no one bothered to check. He'd done things he'd not discussed. That was the point of Darius. He accepted the job and the silence. Lena Alvarez worked at the Morgan Gallery. She processed incoming loans, notarized condition reports, and had a station in the back room where crates arrived with their leafy scent of old paper and varnish. Elena and Lena had once been friends, long before Lena took the gallery job. Lena believed in art the way people believe in second chances. She'd given Elena the opening. Then there was Grace, 20, stoic in an accidental way, and Elena's daughter. Grace didn't know that Elena had once been more law-abiding. She knew the world as a sequence of needed things: tuition, rent, gas, money, and she knew how beautiful her mother could be when she smiled. Elena had sworn never to involve Grace. The ledger had other plans. They had 9 weeks to plan. It sounded obscene, like a luxury. And in the first week, Elena thought she could walk into the gallery and talk the sapphire out of existence the way someone coaxed a wounded bird. She was wrong. The gallery's security was careful and theatrical. Glass thicker than a fist, alarm zones, blink surveillance that made you feel the eyes of the city. The Morgan had the kind of money that left visible traces in the walls, elaborate lighting rigs, padded frames, a staff that practiced crisis protocols like Shakespeare rehearsals. But where there are walls, there are seams. People who work shoulder to shoulder with treasure grow bored and greedy and distracted. They are the places where a ledger can be rewritten. Lena was the seam Elena could slip through. She'd been small and hungry when Emma, the gallery's curator, had promoted her. She'd worked her way into the ledger's finer print: catalogs, condition reports, rope line logistics. She knew every delivery schedule, and she had the kind of access that let her move a crate onto a trolley and tell no one she had done it. Lena's involvement was the knife edge of the whole plan. "We don't steal it because we want it," Elena told them in a warehouse over coffee and stale crackers. "We steal it because keeping it there sold, framed, praised, is what lets its history stay invisible. If we take it out and show the truth, maybe people will ask questions they'd rather not. Maybe it goes home." Jules looked at Elena like she'd invented a new language for bravery. Marcus rubbed his jaw. Darius nodded with the kind of face that meant he would be there if the plan involved a car. And Grace's eyes were wide. Elena had not planned for Grace to be the one who attached the ledger stitches to its new name, but when Grace came down late from college one night and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of marked maps and blurred photographs, she slid into the chair across the table without asking. "You're doing what?" she'd said. "Elena," Marcus said softly. "We don't need her." Elena looked at her daughter and felt the weight of a ledger she could not explain. "She does not work for us," she said. "She works with us." Grace, who had an unblinking capacity for seeing adults do horrible, clever things and deciding they were romantic, became the crew's unexpected wild card, an eager hand where nerves were needed. Elena kept her in roles that required presence and no secrecy. A courier for props, a distraction at the opening roles that allowed Elena to be a mother and a strategist at once. The week of the exhibition, New York felt brittle with attention. Critics wrote long essays about provenance and light. The Sapphire's display was a compass for socialites and scholars alike. Cameras circled. The museum installed temporary guards. Velvet ropes were pulled taut. Elena's blueprint, if you could call it that, avoided explicit instructions like the plague. She focused on stories. Who would be where, how people moved when bored by wealth, what the museum trusted and what it did not. The crew placed themselves in the comfortable creases of the plan. Grace as a volunteer usher, Lena as an assistant preparing the back rooms, Darius with the van parked 3 blocks away, Marcus blending into the crowd, Jules tucked into a hotel room with a laptop and a long coffee. On the night they chose, rain turned the city into a slick, reflective stage. The gallery's after-hours benefit was a black-tie blur. Champagne breathed into the high ceilings like fog. Emma, the curator, made a speech about guardianship and art, and everyone clinked their crystal and meant it. The plan's first, simplest act was misdirection. Marcus, who could read a room like a map, found 2 board members arguing about a proposed wing expansion and suggested loudly, charmingly, that the argument should be moved to the rooftop where the band could drown it out. People love having their emotions honored in public. They will follow a suggestion like a promise. Elena needed the roof emptied in one area and the main crowd diverted. It worked. The band saxophone trembled, and a dozen important people climbed the stairs. Inside, Grace and Lena moved efficiently. Lena rolled a small crate into a back corridor under the pretense of retrieving a loan form. Grace, wearing a volunteer badge, touched a security guard on the elbow and asked, in a voice that suggested a heart about to burst, whether the gallery had a bereavement policy. People like to be needed. The guard, flattered and a little off balance, talked. He left his station for 2 minutes that felt like a year. It was in those 2 minutes that human error and institutional confidence showed their faces at the same time. Security protocols assumed vigilance rather than boredom. They were designed against brute force, not the kinds of small human things a bored guard, an assistant late with a crate that could loosen the seams. Elena never intended to show the seam that would let them pass through. She intended to be careful with it. They did not need to cut glass or climb walls. They needed to move a box from one room to another. And in the midst of the crowd, someone else's hands found a way to open a door because it was an ordinary-looking lever. Lena had practiced the motion a dozen times. She turned the crate, read the labels, and whispered a name she had not heard since childhood. For a moment she saw the coast of Kerala. Jules watched monitors from a rented room across town and supplied breathing instructions and timing adjustments like a remote coach. They kept an eye out for patrol patterns and camera sweeps, but did not, at any point, give organizers a technical primer that would later teach a burglar how to disable a system. Instead, they told Marcus whether the hallway cameras were facing the window or the wall, whether the guard's gait was heavy. The actual moment of taking, if you can call it a single moment, was diffuse and human. It involved Lena replacing the Sapphire's display crate with a near-perfect replica built of painted resin and lab glass. It involved Grace guiding a docent toward an empty wing to ask how long it would take for a loan to be processed. It involved Elena standing in a doorway and making small talk about lighting and the weather. Her voice, the kind of ordinary thing that does not register as a weapon. The Sapphire, for a few heartbeats, was moved. It was then placed into a soft case Darius had smuggled in as an equipment bag. The heist movie conclusion, a silent vault, a laser grid cut by a calm hand, did not happen. The Sapphire left the gallery in a van that smelled of coffee and rain. There were breathless minutes where the air felt glass thin. where the crew sat and let their hearts pound. But when they reached the safe house, when Elena opened the case under a single swinging bulb, the sapphire was there, heavy and darker than its photos, like a piece of night pulled from the sea. But the ledger was not a simple accounting error. The crew learned, in the sober hours after, that ownership is a howl passed among many mouths. The Morgan claimed the group had stolen a legally purchased object. An intermediary fought back. A private collector sent a lawyer who wrote letters with words that sounded like promises of legal violence. Worse, a man Elena had thought untouchable, the owner who'd sold the sapphire, vanished from the public world and surfaced in a way that suggested he was not going to let mistakes like disappeared gems become reputational opportunities. Elena had not been naive. She had assumed there would be consequences. She had not assumed how raw the consequences would be. They went public in the one way that did not feel like the old tabloids. They published a manifesto, not a confession, but a map. It was a letter to the people of a small coastal village in India, to the families whose oral histories claimed the gem, and to the world at large. They included a photograph of the sapphire and a statement. They would return the stone to its ancestral home if a certain set of conditions were met. They would also, publicly, tell their story, the dealings they had uncovered, if the Morgan Gallery and its owner did not agree to mediation. It made no one happy. The gallery called the police. The tabloids called them thieves. The activists called them courageous. Social media spilled arguments like oil. The law patient, unromantic, moved faster than any of them expected. Lena was the first to be arrested. She was charged on a quiet Monday morning as she carried a tote bag of catalogs. The police had an older security feed, and a ring of witnesses, they said, placed her hands on the crate. Marcus turned himself in 2 days later to protect her. Though he had not touched the stone, jewels vanished into a digital forest, their trail smoky and messy, but convincing enough that an investigator would say later that they had made mistakes, copied logs, left breadcrumbs. Darius was pulled over for an unrelated traffic stop, and, under pressure and in the small, human way that pressure makes people clumsy, he incriminated himself. Grace, the youngest, was stopped at the airport when she tried to fly to a friend's wedding. An alert flagged her volunteer badge and a name on a manifest. Elena watched it all crystallize. People she loved in handcuffs. Headlines that made moral obligations look like petty lawlessness. And an owner who had hired lawyers with the precise cruelty of someone buying silence. The court system is not a place for theatrical manifestos. It is a place that prefers contracts and receipts and the bureaucratic poetry of paper. Elena had imagined righteous public pressure. She had not anticipated the speed with which private money could buy silence and the readiness with which institutions would feed police fodder into the gears of justice. The trial, or more accurately, the pleas and hearings that made up the trial, lasted months. Media cycles burned bright and then turned. Emma, the curator, testified about institutional stewardship. The gallery produced provenance paperwork that had holes. The owner of the sapphire produced affidavits. Witnesses disagreed. Lena took a plea deal that would keep her from prison but would cost her months of community service and a public criminal record. Marcus accepted a smaller penalty because he was tired of the moral ledger and wanted to be able to work again. Darius slipped into a witness program somewhere outside the state. Jules, it was rumored, was in Europe and alive, their hair perhaps dyed. Elena did not accept a plea, she argued. She made the courtroom into a different kind of stage. She asked, during cross-examination, about the provenance records and the letters of acquisition. She asked about the price paid and the hands that handled the sapphire before the gallery's purchase. The judge, exasperated at times, listened. The public by then had grown weary of headlines and wanted finality. In the end, there was no cinematic vindication. The Morgan Gallery, faced with a public relations nightmare and a lawsuit from the original owner, agreed to mediation. The mediated agreement included an independent provenance review, the temporary return of the sapphire to a neutral cultural trust, and funds earmarked for a community project in the village claiming the gem. It was messy and bureaucratic and did not satisfy heartbeats. Elena was found guilty of theft in the narrow legal sense, but her sentence was suspended. She paid fines and did community work cataloging, recovered works for museums and teaching ethics classes to undergraduates who insisted she was a folk hero. Grace avoided a conviction because of her age and cooperation. Lena's criminal record remained a cold thing that followed her. Marcus kept his head down and learned to live with the small, weekly fines and the knowledge that his handwriting had been used against him. Jewel never came back. And the Hudson Sapphire? It never made the news again in the same way. It was temporarily placed under the guardianship of a cultural trust that promised to investigate its past. That investigation led, years later, to a slow, painful acknowledgement by an estate that the gem had been acquired under dubious circumstances decades before. The trust negotiated a partial restitution, funds for the village, a traveling exhibition that let families see what had once belonged to their ancestors, and an extended curatorial collaboration that, in quiet ways, recognized harm and tried to do something about it. None of that cured what Elena had lost. None of it gave Lena her youth back, or erased the nights when Elena sat awake and calculated what justice cost in dollars and in years. But the ledger had shifted, even if only a little. Questions were asked that had been muffled. Families had seen their artifacts, even if in glass cases that had replaced living altars. The truth, messy and partial, existed now in a paper trail that could not be wholly dismissed. Years later, on a rainy afternoon that smelled of wet pavement and winter, Elena took her daughter, grown and less earnest now, carrying the kind of wear that comes from surviving, to a small gallery in Kerala that had a traveling exhibit. There, under dimmed lights, lay a tray of objects, curated not as trophies, but as testimonies. Beads, carved teeth, a tiny wooden figurine. There was no global sensation. There were only people with steady hands and honest faces. A woman from a nearby village recognized a pattern on a bead and began to cry. Elena felt those tears like an accounting closing. Grace took Elena's hand then. "We did a bad thing," she said, voice low. "We did something complicated," Elena answered. She thought of the courtrooms and the legalese and the manifestos. She thought of Lena and Marcus and Jules and the sound of rain on the van roof the night they left the Morgan. She had acted outside the law for what she believed was law with a broader scope. She had paid its price. She had no illusions of heroism left. "Did you ever think," Grace asked, "that you'd end up a lesson?" Helena smiled, because she had been taught to smile by survival. "Sometimes you are a lesson, and sometimes you are warned by one. The ledger is messy. It teaches different things to different people." They stood a long time in front of the artifacts. People moved around them, speaking quietly in Malayalam and English. The curator came by and offered tea, a small, human thing. A child touched a bead and was reprimanded gently by a parent. The sapphire was, by then, a footnote in a dozen case studies. The real story, the one Elena thought mattered, had been about people learning the cost of getting justice wrong. In the end, that was what the heist had done. It had forced a conversation. It had required people to choose between the comfort of an immutable ledger and the discomfort of reckoning. Real healing, Elena knew, was slow. It involved paperwork and appeals and apologies that arrived in envelopes, halting and insufficient. There was no cinematic victory march. There was only a slow accounting. The city kept its lights. Museums hung newer works. The economy kept humming. Elena kept teaching. Grace found work that paid enough for both of them to breathe. Lena, who never forgave herself entirely, later opened a small non-profit to help museums inventory their collections fairly. Marcus took a job cataloging recovered artifacts for a regional trust and found, in that steady labor, a kind of peace. Somewhere in a locked vault whose key was watched by more than one set of hands, the Hudson Sapphire lay in a padded case, its color unchanged, its history complicated and allowed. It glittered under a light meant for viewing, not worship, a small object holding a huge, messy ledger where praise, shame, ownership, and restitution tangled together. Elena often thought about that ledger. She wrote notes in the margins of her life now like a curious editor, trying to make sense of her choices. She had stolen a thing she believed had been stolen first. She had paid fines and watched friends get arrested, and she had watched a museum finally agree to look at what it had bought. The ledger had shifted, not solved. And she liked to imagine that somewhere in a village across an ocean, in a quiet archive, in a classroom where a curator taught provenance with humility, that slight, painful change made some future harm less likely. And if someone ever asked her whether it had been worth it, she would pause, as she often did, and speak the truth of the ledger. "It changed a story," she would say. "That is sometimes the only thing you can do." The rest, she believed, was for the historians.